when you look back at history, you kind of expect to find a straight line, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Cause and
Yeah,
effect.
exactly. You drop a glass, gravity pulls it down, and it shatters. Or, someone commits a crime, and there is a very clear motive. The world is supposed to operate on a set of logical rules.
Well, we inherently crave that linear narrative. I mean, the human brain is literally hardwired to find patterns and just, make sense of the chaos around us.
But then, every now and then, you stumble into a historical event that doesn't act like a straight line at all.
Right.
It acts more like a collapsing star. It creates this vacuum so powerful that it just pulls in the gravity of completely unrelated, massive historical events until everything is tangled together.
It really does.
And today we are looking at a collision that is so strange, it honestly feels like Pulp Fiction. But it is entirely real. So picture this. It's June 23, 1965. You are standing on a quiet, tree-lined residential street in the Montrose neighborhood of Houston, Texas.
And it is hot.
Oh, incredibly hot. It's a sweltering, oppressive summer day. Houston police have just received a call from a man named Marvin, and he is increasingly panicked.
Right, because he hasn't been able to reach his aunt and uncle.
Exactly. His 79-year-old aunt, Edwina Rogers, and her 83-year-old husband, Fred. They've been unreachable for days. So 2 patrol officers are dispatched to 1815 Driscoll Street to conduct just, a routine welfare check.
And the initial sweep of the house reveals a scene of almost eerie domestic normalcy.
Yeah, the officers force their way in through the back door, and inside it's just dead quiet.
Nothing obvious.
Right, nothing. On the dining room table, they find a spoon, some scissors, and 2 copies of the Houston Post TV schedule casually tossed aside.
Just everyday stuff.
Yeah. And in the kitchen, there is a cast iron pan sitting on the stove with a sharp knife resting nearby. It really just looks like the couple, stepped out for a walk.
But then one of the officers decides to open the refrigerator.
Yeah, this hulking 5'3" appliance just humming in the corner.
And that is the exact moment the straight line of history shatters.
It really does, because inside the fridge, sitting neatly on the wire shelves, the officer sees what looks like numerous cuts of washed, unwrapped meat.
Which is strange, but...
Right. But for a split second, his brain rationalizes the image. He thinks it is butchered hog meat, maybe prepped for a summer neighborhood cookout or something.
Your mind tries to protect you.
Exactly. But as he goes to close the heavy door, he glances down through the clear glass of the vegetable bin at the bottom. And inside a brown paper sack, he spots 2 human heads.
Oh, man. The grim reality was that the heads belonged to Fred and Edwina Rogers.
Yeah.
What the officer initially thought was hog meat were actually the couple's dismembered limbs and torsos. And the autopsy details, if we look at the reports, are visceral and horrifying. They paint a picture of intense personal rage.
Really intense.
Police determined the couple had been killed a few days prior, fittingly enough, on Father's Day. Fred, the 83-year-old father, had been bludgeoned to death with a claw hammer. His eyes had been brutally gouged out and his genitalia were removed.
It's just horrific.
And Edwina had been savagely beaten and then shot, execution style, in the head.
But what really gets me about this whole scene is that the house was virtually spotless. Like there was almost no blood found anywhere on the main floor.
Which tells us something terrifying about the killer's state of mind. They didn't panic. They took the time to systematically dismantle the victims in the upstairs bathroom.
Right.
The killer clearly possessed a distinct knowledge of anatomy because they carefully removed the internal organs, cut them into smaller pieces, and flushed them down the toilet into the Houston sewer system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they cleaned the crime scene with chilling, methodical precision.
They cleaned everything except for a single trail of blood leading to one specific room in the house. And that was the bedroom of the couple's 43-year-old son, Charles Rogers.
The only suspect.
Yeah. In that room, police found a blood-stained keyhole saw. But they didn't find Charles.
Charles immediately became the sole focus. And when investigators started looking into who Charles Rogers actually was, well, the mystery deepened significantly.
He wasn't exactly your average drifter.
Not at all. He possessed a highly unusual and frankly elite background. He held a degree in nuclear physics from the University of Houston.
Nuclear physics.
Right. He was a former United States Navy pilot who served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, during World War II. And after the war, he spent 9 years working as a seismologist for Shell Oil.
Doing what exactly?
Mapping subterranean rock formations using explosives.
Unbelievable. He also spoke 7 languages, was deeply entrenched in the amateur ham radio community, and had this proven talent for finding oil and gold deposits.
Okay, let's unpack this because the living situation makes zero sense.
Oh, it really doesn't.
You have this brilliant, highly trained man with a background in nuclear physics, naval intelligence, and corporate geology. Yet, by 1965, he is unemployed, living under his elderly parents' roof, and basically acting like a ghost.
Ghost is the perfect descriptor for him. I mean, neighbors had no idea he even lived at the house.
Wait, really? The neighbors didn't know? No. He would leave the property before dawn, return long after dark, and communicate with his parents almost exclusively by slipping handwritten notes under their bedroom doors.
That is so bizarre.
He completely refused to eat with them, choosing to cook his own meals on a small hot plate up in his bedroom.
So he is literally a phantom living in his own home. And then, after allegedly committing this incredibly gruesome, anatomically precise double murder, he just evaporates into thin air.
Completely vanishes.
In 1965, long before the digital age, a nationwide FBI manhunt turns up absolutely nothing. He leaves behind his pilot's license, his Navy discharge papers, and that bloody saw,
Yeah.
and just ceases to exist.
And see, when a man with that level of intelligence and that enigmatic of a background vanishes without a trace, he leaves behind a massive narrative vacuum.
Oh, for sure.
And the public imagination absolutely abhors a vacuum. Because law enforcement couldn't find him, people eventually filled that void with the biggest boogeyman of the era. By the early 1990s, researchers weren't just looking for a local Houston murderer anymore.
No, they were looking for a scapegoat for the crime of the century.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a 1992 book called The Man on the Grassy Knoll by John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers, which is featured heavily in our Back Channels magazine source.
A fascinating read, honestly.
Oh, it is wild. These authors put forward a theory that takes the Icebox Murders and essentially straps a Saturn V rocket to them.
Mhm.
They claim that Charles Rogers wasn't just a reclusive, unemployed seismologist. They argue he was a highly trained CIA operative.
And not just a low-level informant either.
No. According to this book, Charles Rogers was the man who impersonated Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City, and he was one of the actual shooters who assassinated President John F. Kennedy in Dealey Plaza on November 2010, 1963.
It is a breathtaking escalation.
Yeah.
I mean, tying a domestic murder suspect to a presidential assassination requires a colossal leap of faith and some incredibly creative dot connecting.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you have to ask the obvious question.
The
Right. If he was a CIA super assassin who successfully pulled off the ultimate political hit, why on earth did he chop up his elderly parents in Houston 2 years later?
It's the gaping hole in the theory.
The book's explanation is completely unhinged. They claim that Roger's mother, Edwina, was secretly tracking his clandestine telephone calls following the JFK assassination.
Like she's checking the long-distance bill.
Yes. And to cover his tracks, he brutally murdered them and shoved them in the fridge. So we are supposed to believe a highly trained intelligence operative can execute the President of the United States, frame a patsy, escape the Secret Service undetected.
Right, flawlessly.
But his only solution for his mom checking his phone bill is to beat her, shoot her, dismember her, and leave her in the family icebox.
It strains credulity way past the breaking point. But to understand how a theory like this actually gains traction and gets published, we really have to look at the psychological context of the era.
The 1990s paranoia.
Yes. If you read the interview with author Jim DiEugenio in the fall 1992 issue of Back Channels magazine, he discusses the prevailing theories of the time. The 90s were rife with paranoia about the CIA and the mafia colluding to kill Castro and eventually Kennedy.
Fueled by movies and books, right?
Precisely. This was fueled by the investigations of Jim Garrison and the shadowy exploits of figures like David Ferrie and Clay Shaw.
And Charles Rogers simply had the perfect resume to get swept up in that cultural paranoia.
He really did. Rogers served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is the exact same intelligence branch that Lee Harvey Oswald purportedly had ties to.
Oh, I see the connection.
Furthermore, Rogers was reportedly in the Civil Air Patrol in the mid-1950s, where he supposedly crossed paths with David Ferrie, an alleged key conspirator in the JFK plot. Because Rogers was permanently missing, he became the ultimate blank slate.
Right, because he can't defend himself.
Exactly. Conspiracy writers could project whatever grand, shadowy narrative they wanted onto him, completely safe in the knowledge that he would never surface to sue them or deny it.
But, a resume isn't quite enough. To actually place Rogers in Dallas on that fateful day in 1963, the conspiracy theorists linked him to one of the most famous, obsessively debated photographs in American history.
The Three Tramps photograph.
Yes. If you have ever gone down a JFK rabbit hole, you have absolutely seen these images. Shortly after Kennedy was shot, Dallas police and local news photographers captured several pictures of three homeless men being escorted by police through Dealey Plaza, right near the Texas School Book Depository.
They'd been found hiding in a boxcar in the nearby railroad yards.
Over the decades, the true identities of these three men became the subject of intense, almost fanatical speculation.
Oh, the theories of who these men really were read like a who's who of 20th century infamy.
It is a wild list. People claim the tramps were Watergate burglars, E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis.
Which is quite a claim.
Then there was Chauncey Holt, a man who brazenly claimed he delivered phony Secret Service credentials to the assassins in Dealey Plaza. Then you had Charles Harrelson, who was actually actor Woody Harrelson's father, who was a real-life contract killer and literally confessed to killing JFK during a 6-hour cocaine-fueled standoff with police in 1982.
Just unbelievable characters.
And naturally, the authors of The Man on the Grassy Knoll claim that one of those tramps was the fugitive from the Icebox Murders, Charles Rogers.
The authors even went so far as to theorize that Charles Harrelson, Chauncey Holt, and Charles Rogers were the three men in the photo, working together as an elite hit squad.
The three tramps photograph essentially functioned as a historical Rorschach test. Every single conspiracy theorist looked at these three clean-shaven, relatively well-dressed transients and saw exactly the villain they needed to complete their own specific puzzle.
Right, exactly.
You need a CIA operative, boom, there he is on the left. You need a mafia hitman, look at the jawline on the guy in the middle.
What's fascinating here is how the actions of the authorities at the time inadvertently engineered this whole myth.
Oh, totally. They fumbled it.
The Dallas Police Department detained these three men as investigated prisoners, but then abruptly released them just 4 days later. They seemingly lost the arrest records. They lost the mugshots. They lost the fingerprints.
It's careless.
That profound lack of official transparency acted as an accelerant. When the official record goes dark, conspiracy just thrives in the shadows.
And those records stayed dark for almost 30 years, until 1992, when the whole grand, shadowy CIA mafia assassin theory came crashing down into an incredibly boring reality.
And that reality was uncovered by a journalist named Mary LaFontaine.
She managed to track down the original November 20, 1963 Dallas police arrest records that had finally been released from the archives. And the names on those faded documents, they weren't E. Howard Hunt, they weren't Charles Harrelson, and they certainly weren't Charles Rogers.
The men were officially identified as Gus W. Abrams, Harold Doyle, and John F. Gedney.
They were just three unemployed guys riding the rails, passing through Dallas looking for work.
Just regular people.
And the reason they looked so clean-shaven and well-dressed in the photos, which, remember, had fueled 3 decades of suspicion that they were disguised intelligence agents, was simply because they had stayed at a local homeless shelter the night before.
Exactly. They had showered, eaten a hot meal, and put on clean, donated clothes before heading back to the rail yard to hop another train.
It is the ultimate anticlimax to a 30-year mystery.
It really is.
I always think about the quote from Harold Doyle. When a television program finally tracked him down in 1992 to ask him about being a suspected presidential assassin, he just shook his head and said, "I am a plain guy, a simple country boy, and that's the way I want to stay. I wouldn't be a celebrity for $10 million.
Wow.
And Gus Abrams, he had just lived his life as an itinerant train hopper until he quietly passed away in 1987. They were exactly who they appeared to be.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a deep psychological truth about how we process history. Even after Mary LaFontaine published these records, and even after Doyle and Gedney independently confirmed the story on camera, some conspiracy researchers still refuse to accept the evidence.
They just wouldn't let it go.
No. They continued to publish books maintaining other identifications. It highlights why people desperately cling to the idea of a massive, shadowy government plot.
Because the alternative is scary.
Right. The alternative, that the President of the United States can be murdered by a lone gunman and 3 random guys in a train yard can just be in the wrong place at the wrong time, means the world is fundamentally random. It's chaotic. Accepting that a coincidence is just a coincidence is often more terrifying than believing anyone is secretly in control.
But, you know, if the tramps were just tramps, and Charles Rogers wasn't a CIA assassin hanging out in Dealey Plaza, the grand conspiracy kind of evaporates.
It does.
Yet, we are still left with the gruesome reality of the Icebox murders. Why did a brilliant, multilingual nuclear physicist chop up his parents?
To find that answer, we have to strip away the spy novel theories and look at the painstaking, unglamorous work of Houston forensic accountants Hugh and Martha Gardnier.
Forensic accountants solving a murder.
Yeah. They spent years investigating the Rogers estate, basically looking past the rumors and focusing entirely on the actual paper trail Charles and his parents left behind.
And what they found in those bank statements and property deeds is profoundly depressing.
It is. The Gardners' research portrays a much darker, grounded reality. By examining decades of canceled checks, tax returns, and land transfers, they discovered that Fred Rogers was not an innocent victim.
Not at all.
He was an abusive, petty criminal who operated as a bookie, engaging in illegal gambling and fraud. More importantly, he was deeply physically and emotionally abusive toward Charles, an abuse that continued well into Charles's adulthood.
It's awful.
Furthermore, the paper trail proved both Fred and Edwina were systematically stealing from him.
Because Charles had actually acquired significant properties and wealth through his successful career as a seismologist for Shell Oil.
Right.
The forensic accounting showed that Edwina was forging his signature and secretly selling off properties that Charles owned, while Fred was siphoning large sums of his money to cover gambling debts.
So you have a highly intelligent man suffering a lifetime of emotional and physical abuse combined with massive financial ruin, all happening under the roof of this quiet suburban home.
Just a pressure cooker.
Exactly. Eventually, according to the Gardners' theory, the pressure simply broke him. He snapped. He planned the murder, executed it with the precision of a man who understood anatomy, cleaned the scene, and ran.
And he didn't need the CIA to help him vanish off the face of the earth, did he?
Not at all. His background provided everything he needed. Working as a seismologist for a major oil company in the 1950s meant Charles was mapping remote locations, often working directly with international mining camps in Central America.
Ah, the connections.
Right. Combined with his deep involvement in the ham radio community, he had a massive off-the-grid network. The Gardners theorize he wasn't just chatting on that radio. He was communicating directly with his contacts in Mexico and Honduras, arranging safe passage and employment in remote areas where U.S. law enforcement had absolutely zero jurisdiction.
He utilized those specific, highly specialized connections to quietly slip out of the United States, and his story supposedly comes to an end in one of those remote camps. The prevailing theory is that Charles Rogers was eventually killed in Honduras over a wage dispute with local miners.
A quiet, violent end for a man who committed a horrific violent crime.
So what does this all mean for you? As someone listening and trying to make sense of this incredible story, how do we process this?
I think it forces us to confront our own biases and really what we choose to pay attention to.
Human nature is magnetically drawn to the spectacular. Like, we would so much rather read a sprawling thriller about an international CIA hit squad, secret agents, and presidential assassinations.
It's entertaining. It's a grand puzzle to solve.
Exactly. But the truth of the Icebox Murders isn't a spy thriller. It's the dark, mundane, and deeply uncomfortable reality of domestic violence, elder abuse, and severe financial manipulation happening behind the closed doors of a totally average-looking suburban home. We would rather look at the grassy knoll than look at the reality of family trauma.
We seek grand explanations to avoid confronting intimate horrors. The truth was hiding in a ledger, not in a classified intelligence file.
To briefly recap this incredible journey we've been on today, we started by opening a bloody refrigerator in Houston, Texas in 1965. A crime scene so bizarre it defied explanation.
Truly.
Because the suspect, Charles Rogers, vanished so completely, his story was hijacked by the culture. He was transported to the grassy knoll in Dallas, thrown into the labyrinth of 1990s CIA and mafia conspiracy theories, and branded an assassin of President Kennedy.
But then reality caught up.
Yes. When the dust finally settled, the historical records, the arrest sheets, and the bank statements pulled us back down to earth. Back down to the tragic, grounded reality of human frailty, abuse, and a mind pushed past its breaking point.